Welcome, students. Today we are on chapter 5 on photosynthesis. The main student learning outcomes is that you understand the importance of photosynthesis. It's just like an amazing fundamental chemical reaction that is sustaining life. There won't be life without photosynthesis. So you'll be able to understand the importance of photosynthesis. You will understand the relevance of photosynthesis to all the other living organisms in the earth. You'll be able to identify the chemical reaction of photosynthesis, the reactants, and the products. You will understand the main structures in a eukaryotic cell that will synthesize sugars by photosynthesis. We'll also lightly understand the wavelength of light that is ideal for photosynthesis. We'll go over the two main steps in photosynthesis. It's called light-dependent reaction and light-independent reaction or Calvin cycle. And also variations in photosynthesis called C4 and C-CAM plants. They have slightly different way of getting their carbon. So these two plants, they live in very dry desert environments. So they have a little bit of change. All the other plants are called C3 plants. So here's a good animation of the overall process of photosynthesis. You know, light, carbon dioxide and water is absorbed by the plant and it does its magic and it makes sugars. So who does photosynthesis? All life on Earth are dependent on photosynthesis for the energy. So here we have this little bird. You know, it looks like the bird is eating a berry that was made by photosynthesis. So all living things, most of the living things, they are dependent on plants for food or energy source. So who does photosynthesis? So there's three pictures as to who does photosynthesis. Plants, we know, eukaryotic, they do photosynthesis. Algae, pond scum, they do photosynthesis. Some protists can also do photosynthesis. There's also some bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They are called blue-green bacteria or cyanobacteria. And because they can make their own food by using water and carbon and sunlight, they are called photoautotrophs. So now the sugars that are made by the photoautotrophs are eaten by the autotrophs in order to survive. So if you go to the supermarket and you see all these processed food on the shelves like cereal and chips and all of them are products of photosynthesis. So in other words, photosynthesis is the backbone of the food chain. So we either eat the plant or we eat the animal that ate the plant in order to survive. I thought this is very interesting. See this NASA picture. It's showing photosynthetic activity all over the world. And you can see it's the global distribution of photosynthesis, both in the terrestrial ecosystem and aquatic ecosystem. How come there's so much green activity going on in the oceans? It's because this is where the protists or the phytoplanktons grow. And they do photosynthesis. They form the bottom layer of the food chain. So, you know, phytoplanktons are very, very small, and the little shrimp will eat that, and a small fish will eat the shrimp. The larger fish will eat the small fish, and so forth. So, in other words, the backbone of the food web is by phytoplankton activity. It is a protist, kind of like algae kind. You know, that's why you see a lot of photosynthetic activity in the oceans. It says dark red and blue indicate high regions of photosynthetic activity. You never knew this, right? I didn't realize this either. And I was in awe when I saw this picture. So anytime you say photosynthesis is happening, that means it's releasing carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen in the atmosphere. So the second thing that you and I need for survival is oxygen. So that's why this connection between photosynthesis and climate change and greenhouse effect and all that. So the best way to mitigate climate change would be to increase photosynthetic activity in the world. That's why we plant trees. There are many activists that say that if we can plant 1 trillion trees, we can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Very interesting stuff. So I already told you what a photoautotroph is. So this is the equation for photosynthesis. It's plants are taking very simple things like carbon dioxide from the air, water from the roots, from the earth, using sunlight. In the presence of sunlight, it's able to weave these two compounds together to make sugar molecules. And the byproduct is oxygen. So the two things you and I need for survival, food and oxygen, comes from photosynthesis. So that's why they say life as we know it evolved. If life as we know it has to evolve the way we know it, photosynthesis must have evolved much, much earlier, because that's how it built up the oxygen content in the atmosphere. And that gave rise to aerobic organisms. So here's a picture from your book. So we have a tree. It is absorbed in the presence of sunlight. It's absorbing carbon dioxide and water to make sugars. So any organism that is able to do photosynthesis is called as a photoautotroph. It's using light. If it's using chemicals as an energy source, it will be called as a chemoautotroph. And they are the primary producers in the ecosystem. That means super important. If something happens to them, it will affect the whole food chain, the food web, and the higher levels of the ecosystem. Heterotrophs are dependent on the autotrophs. Like you and I, we don't have chloroplast or chlorophyll, and we cannot do photosynthesis. And that's why we should either eat the plant or the animal that ate the plant. So you and I are heterotroph. We are dependent on autotrophs for our energy and for survival. So keep this equation in mind. So let's go into photosynthesis. So the first question you have to ask is, where does photosynthesis happen? And we are talking about photosynthesis in plants now, eukaryotic cells. So here, there's a leaf here. If you zoom into the leaf, it will have something called cuticle. It's like a waxy coating on top. That is to prevent evaporation. It's called transpiration. The upper layer is called epidermis. Epi means on top. Dermis means skin. Epidermis. The middle layer is called mesophyll cells. See these rectangular cells? And there's also these loose cells. So this is where the photosynthesis happens. And then we have lower epidermis. And here's an interesting cell. It's called a guard cell. So here's a pore through which gas can enter and leave. So carbon dioxide comes in and oxygen leaves the pore. So the pore or the hole is called stomata. So this is the anatomy of a cell. So inside a cell, here in this animation, you can see chloroplast. So these organelles, it is called cytoplasmic streaming. See like how they are moving around. They can be like 50 to 100 chloroplast in every cell. And they're actually moving around the vacuole that you can't see. And you zoom into the chloroplast, you can see that it has two membranes. It's double membrane. And then there's a stack of membranes called thylakoids. And the whole stack is called as granum. So it's like, looks like somebody stacked up some pita bread on top of each other. So they are the thylakoid membranes. The liquid part inside the cytoplasm, it is called stroma. There's an R here, the That's how it's different from stomata. This is the stroma. A stack of thylakoid membranes is called as a granum. So it's here in the granum and the stroma that the chemical reactions of photosynthesis will occur. So what light is ideal for photosynthesis? You know what? The nature of light is very, very unique, right? Light can travel in waves and also as a particle. You know, if it's a particle, they'll call it as a photon of light. So the wavelength of a single wave is the distance between the two peaks. So the sun is the main form of energy. It's electromagnetic radiation. And this is existing in different wavelengths. So this, what you're seeing here is the visible light wavelength, which is 400 to 700 nanometers. So this is the visible range. You know, gamma rays, radio waves are beyond this point here. Infrared rays, they are not included here. This is only the visible range. So plants and also other photosynthesizing organisms, see, the amount of sunlight is very, very different. For example, a tall tree, you know, has access to all the wavelengths, whereas different wavelength of light is going to hit the forest floor here. That is why plants have different pigments to absorb light. But most of the absorption for photosynthesis happens in the, see this range, UV range here, blue-red range, blue and red range. All the green color range is not absorbed. So for example, chlorophyll A is absorbing here, chlorophyll B, carotenoids. So in the visible range, the blue and violet seems to be ideal for photosynthesis, and also red. Plants do not like green wavelength of light. That is why they appear green. They throw out the green color, and that's why they appear green to our eyes. So the wavelength of light that is ideal for plant growth is blue, violet, and also red, orange. So here is the overview of photosynthesis. This is a very good picture here. There are two reactions happening. So in order to accomplish this equation on top here, carbon dioxide and water coming together in the presence of light is making sugars. So this is a glucose molecule, C6H12O6. And byproduct is oxygen. This is accomplished through a series of chemical reactions. And we are only studying the overview in our lecture today. So there are two steps. One is depending on light. So it is called light dependent reaction. The second step, it does not require light. So people call it light independent reaction, or after the person who discovered it, Melvin Calvin, it's also called Calvin cycle. So if you split that word photo and synthesis, right? So here's the light dependent reaction. The location it happens is in the thylakoid membrane that is full of chlorophyll pigment molecules. So light is hitting it. Some kind of chemical reactions are happening. It is going to absorb water and it's going to give off oxygen at this step. So that is the photo part. In synthesize means to make, right? To weave together. So what are the products of the light dependent reaction? So these three things are going in, but it's also making ATP energy and the electron carrier NADPH. So this is an electron carrier. These two are vital for Calvin cycle to go. It's a cycle. So it's going to go round and round and round in the stroma of the chloroplast. So this is where the sugars are made. And this is where carbon dioxide is entering the cycle. So this is called carbon fixation happening in the Calvin cycle. So the products of the light reactions will become the reactants in the Calvin cycle. And then it will replenish it itself. You know, it will give the NADP and ADP to the light reactions, and then it will get charged and it will come to the Calvin cycle. Huge discovery. Most of the people who discovered photosynthesis reactions, they all got a Nobel Prize. Huge discovery. So you should know what's going into the cycle and what's coming out for both steps. So here's the light dependent reaction. So you can see, so what's happening here is the overall chemistry of the light dependent reaction is that it's converting light energy into chemical energy that will be used up in the Calvin cycle. And it is happening in the thylakoid membrane. It will produce ATP and NADPH that is required for Calvin cycle. All right, so this is the thylakoid membrane. In the thylakoid membrane, there are these series of proteins. Some can absorb light, so they are called photosystems. First, there'll be something called photosystem 2, then photosystem 1. It's called 2 because it was discovered later. And then there's proteins. There's a protein called cytochrome. So it is a electron shuttle protein. Just like how we saw the electron transport chain in cellular respiration, this is kind of flipped, but it's very similar. So the light energy, a photon of light, is absorbed by the chlorophyll molecule found in the thylakoid membrane, which will release the electrons. So what happens is this light is triggering the electron transport pathway, the shuttling of electrons. So the electron transport pump, the electron transport chain will pump hydrogen ions into the lumen of the thylakoid, into the inside of the thylakoid. Step 3, this is where water is involved. Water will be split. It's called hydrolysis. Water is split to produce replacement electrons in order to make the electrons chain going. So when the electron chain is happening, a buildup of protons accumulate in the lumen of the thylakoid, in the inside of the thylakoid. Again, if you compare it with cellular respiration, it is flipped. In cellular respiration, the hydrogen ion concentration will be higher in the inner membrane space. So this is different here. But when the hydrogen ions will flow through ATP synthase, it will produce ADP. It will produce ATP from ADP. So the energy molecule will be made and the electrons will fall to NADPH, and that will accept the electron to produce NADP will become NADPH. So the two things required for Calvin cycle is made in the light dependent reaction. And here's a close-up of the reaction center. See, this is the photosystem 2. So when light hits the photosystem, it will trigger the electron transport chain. So electrons are shuttled. And replacement electrons will come from the lysis of water. Actually, this photon of light hitting in the light-dependent reaction, it will happen twice. So now we have made NADPH and ATP. So let's move to the stroma, that is the liquid part of the chloroplast, to see the next reaction. So here's the electron shuttle, and then we made NADPH and ATP. So in the light-dependent reaction, these are the byproducts, ATP and NADPH. This is just a nice picture where you can see the lipid bilayer of the thylakoid membrane. You can see photosystem 2, photosystem 1, and you can see there are 2 points of entry for photons of light to keep the electron transport chain going. And here you can see NADP reduced to NADPH. This is the electron carrier. And then this is the molecular motor. So when hydrogen runs from high concentration from inside to outside, it will make ATP. So we are going to the next step in photosynthesis, which is called a Calvin cycle or light independent reaction. So this is a cycle. The This is where carbon dioxide enters the picture here. So the carbon dioxide that entered the cell through the stomata is going to come here. And the whole process is divided into 3 steps. The first step is called carbon fixation. Rubisco is the compound. So here, by enzymatic process, right, carbon will be fixed. And then ATP goes into it, and then it will get reduced. And then NADP goes into it to form 3 carbon sugars. It's called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So that is why plants that use this method of photosynthesis are called C3 plants. In general, most of the plants you see are called C3 plants because it makes a 3 carbon compound. And then the cycle continues with the regeneration of ribulose bisphosphate. So that's why it's called cycle. It goes round and round. Carbon dioxide enters and sugars come out. So 2 3 carbon compounds will combine to form a 6 carbon compound. So plants that live in very dry environments, they have other ways of doing photosynthesis. Like a cactus in a desert where there's no rain, right? If it opens its stomata during the day, it can lose water. So it doesn't want to do it. So to overcome that, there is C4 plants and CAM plants. So here is a C4 plant, which is a good picture is sugarcane. Another good example is the corn that it's very common. So what it will do is when the climate is conducive, it will open its stomata, bring in the carbon dioxide, and then it will make an organic acid with it. And it will store the acid in bundle sheet cells. So these are like special cells, like they're called vessels, bundle sheet cells in leaves. So it will store it into an organic acid, and then it will use the organic acid as a carbon source. Desert plants like cactus or pineapple, they will open the stomata only at night. Crassulacean acid metabolism. They will open at night and they will form something called malate or malic acid. And then they will use it during the day as a carbon source for the citric acid cycle. So plants have a way of overcoming harsh environments. In prokaryotes that do not have chloroplast, but they are still able to do photosynthesis, they have infolding of the plasma membrane, kind of similar to the thylakoids. Even though it's not an organelle, it has all the components necessary for carrying out photosynthesis. So the pigments will be found right here in the invaginated plasma membrane, like bacteria. So here's a slide that kind of summarizes how the energy flow in the ecosystem is maintained by both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So if you see the overall equation for photosynthesis, it is the opposite of cellular respiration. See, the reactants of one is the products of the other. So that is why life on Earth is very, very tightly connected. So like we are interdependent. Plants, animals are very much dependent on plants. I thought this was very interesting. We've always only seen plants doing photosynthesis, but now they have discovered this slug. It is Elysia chlorotica. So this slug has been eating algae so much that this algae is incorporated in the tissues of the slug, and then it can do its own photosynthesis. Isn't that amazing? I will stop the recording now, and I hope that was useful, and we'll watch a video. Can you see the video?
No.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide.